Yeah.
Did you just pause
Nope,
it,
nope.
or are
We're
you going to
just
be able to edit this later?
yeah. We're just I'll edit later.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay. Basically, yeah, you were saying he sounds a lot like Bob Dylan. I think it's important to note that this day Bob Dylan is very, very well known, and yet Phil Oakes is basically forgotten to history. Yet here he is, these very relevant stuff that just updating with some recent cultural references. This is more apropos than ever.
Mm,
And now we've seen almost an altogether death of the radical left that at least there was some semblance of in the 60s. To today, you really have nothing but liberals. Then you've got people like us out on the fringes attempting things like podcasts and trying to get the word out there. We don't really have a lot of radical organizing, and if it is, it's relatively fringe or is seen more on amongst environmentalists or animal rights people. But in terms of advocating for actual humans, I just don't see a lot of radical organizing anymore. I was a part of the global justice movement, which was, like the battle in Seattle in 1999, where there was this new consciousness of like, hey, we've got to address this global nightmare, right? That we at the time called, today we call it corporatism. Uh,
mm,
you can call it corporate capitalism. This idea that you take everything wealth, you pick it up from the bottom, and you the top into fewer and fewer hands. So, and take everything of value and commodify it. So, no resource, the tree, minerals have any worth until it's exploited and extracted.
mm.
So when you add humans into that mix, likewise, we don't have value in our freedom, but if you put us in prison, we're worth a lot, right? And I don't make any important distinction between working in the corporate place and prison. I'm not making any important difference there. It's sad to think that the last truly free people are homeless people living out on the street,
Mhm.
which is a horribly violent place. Lifespan is extremely low. They're exposed to is extraordinary. Uh, Lots of mental illness, etc. So, I mean, I'm obviously a huge can of worms at this can chip away
Mm.
at them little by little. The internet,
Right, right.
mental health, and capitalism, right? So, for example, there's a model of psychotherapy that's been of tremendous horror and deprivation, exploitation. If you do that, you're a
Mm.
sociopath. You should be at
Right, right.
the very least a little bit anxious. You know, just otherwise you're blind or you're have no empathy.
Mm.
How, how do you look out into the see the mass suffering and the thing? When you look at oppression today, the coincidence that, for example, we chose to podcast today, we happened to just at the last minute before we did this, I sent you this video. It just so happened to be an updated version of Trayvon Martin, and it just so happened to be his birthday.
Mhm.
This, I'm not sort of magical. No, what
Mm.
it is the robustness of oppression so vast that we can even like this. In other words, there's so much oppression everywhere that every single day is going to be the anniversary of some sort of iconic level of oppression. Now, Trayvon Martin is not just about that young boy. The reason why it was such a big deal is because it was emblematic, not just of
Mhm.
what's going on to young black men all over this country, but to what happened to young black men throughout history. And what's so
Right.
fascinating about all that is the fact that it was so visible for, which is why I think the marketing of the idea of Black Lives Matter is so profound because nothing could be further from the truth. This country was founded upon a very firm Black lives don't matter.
And still today they
Not
treat the same way.
system, not nation. Right. So, when you think about the Three-Fifths Compromise and how slave states, I mean, Georgia, okay? Georgia, it was in its colonial days, At one point, I think something like 90% of their population was African slaves, okay? So they wanted 3/5. There were hardly any white people. They really needed that 3/5 of a person to count, right? But it's important that they counted for the population, not ever hold any actual political power. So you look at gerrymandering today. You look at
The
all of these.
Electoral College.
Well, sure, the Electoral College is a big part of it, and I actually really like what Trump has done with this illegal stuff, which is pretty clearly illegal. I mean, whether anything will
He's
happen of it,
exposed the
but
system.
I think
He's exposed the system.
he really has exposed the fact that if you want almost legal, right, by having alternate electors show up to the Electoral College, right, they could have swung the election, because not only is the popular vote not reflected, even it's the Electoral College that elects the president, right? And some states have a binding agreement where the electors are bound to vote the way the state did, but that's not even necessarily true. That was ad hoc. That was put in later. At the time, it was really just up to the electors to vote how they wanted.
That's how why they're screaming. The Republicans are like, "Oh, states' rights this, states' rights that."
Yeah, right. States' rights when it matters. When states' rights when they want to do something horribly provincial and regressive, right, and backwards. Now, so let's talk a little bit about our concept of what is outside the Beltway, right? So we don't. Nobody on the left or the right, nobody aside from liberals, if you have a master's degree or a PhD, or you're very well educated, you work in journalism with a capital J, then yeah, of course you think that the electoral system, and our judicial system, all that kind of stuff, the Beltway, it works. Democracy, it works. A lot like what this song said. But aside from that very effete yet powerful and well represented minority, aside from that, no one seriously thinks that any significant or meaningful change could possibly occur within the Beltway, which is why, the title of our series here, Outside the Beltway, is meant very ironically. I can't remember who said it. They said if voting made a difference, they'd outlaw it, right?
They're trying.
Right. Well, that too. Again, I'm not logic, but yeah, you look at all the red states and the state council, the state legislatures, whether it's whatever system that each state has, you'll see that Republicans had a very successful campaign where they said, look, we're going to have a 50-state strategy. We're not going to just focus on the red states. We're going to focus on every state, and we're going to focus on the local level. And what they correctly realized is that if you can control the states, you could, for example, in this case, control the electors, right? That we send to elect the president. In this case, what they're doing is they're having tremendous success in voter suppression. Now, let's talk about Jim Crow, right? So Jim Crow laws were set up so that you could suppress black votes post Reconstruction. So after so just to remind your audience, in American history, up until the civil rights in the 60s, it was the Democrats that were the right-wing party. They were the pro-slavery, white supremacist, pro-war, anti-democracy party. They were the Democratic Party was controlled by the top 10% richest slave owners. So not just slave owners in general, just the richest of them. Okay?
So like
now,
he said, the
Republican Party,
Democrats
on the other
started
hand,
the KKK, but roles reversed.
Yes, correct. KKK and the Democratic Party were bedfellows. So, which is why in the 60s you had this notion of the Dixiecrat, right?
Right.
Traditionally throughout the
Exactly.
conservatives, pro-slavery, anti-black,
But the
and
parties reversed.
people voted Republicans because it was the Republicans that freed slaves. Even
Right.
don't hear anymore, right? Again, why is it making an important difference between an important difference? It's sadly it's cosmetic, you know. So are you okay with the, okay?
With the what?
So
Okay. Yep, you're good.
okay. So and yeah, yes. So that's why I mean. So when more black congressmen than there are today, and they had good representation, vote rights, etc., enforced by the Union military occupying Confederacy. Right now, with the election of Johnson, who was the first president to be impeached, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken, Johnson, I can't remember, President Johnson,
Yeah.
and yeah, he made a compromise where he said, okay, we're going to get rid of Reconstruction. Reconstruction ended with him. That's when Jim Crow was instituted. That's where you see KKK rise up. You see, for example, literacy tests, right? Now, if you were a white and you showed up and you were illiterate, they didn't issue the literacy test. But if you were black and you showed up, then you were given a literacy test.
And they
Likewise,
had to
a
count
voter test.
count the beans in the jar.
Oh, okay. I don't know about that one.
They also had to do that. Yeah, blacks had to count the beans in the jar to be able to. That was part of the Jim Crow, uh, you know,
Okay.
suppression, voting
Yeah, they also
suppression.
had a voter tax, which if a white person came and couldn't pay it, they would waive it. So this is also where we see anti-vagrancy laws and anti-loitering laws. What did that mean? If you had a couple of black men sitting around on a street corner, they were loitering, they were vagrants, and you would lock them up, right? A couple of whites
And
hanging out
that
on the corner,
started the
it wouldn't be
prison industry. The prison
industrial
industry started.
complex. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this is what Jim Crow looked like. And then we could talk about sundown towns
Right.
as well.
They still
This
exist.
is something they still exist, and this is something that we are. It's criminal that we're not taught this in school, considering how fundamentally important it was to the majority of America. Take a look at a blue state, California, right? I think we had something like 38 sundown towns, right?
Wow.
So don't let the sun grow was the idea of a sundown town, right?
Right.
In other words, if you were black and you were in that town after the sun went down, they would lock you up for the night, and the next morning they take you outside of city limits and say, go on, don't come back, right? You could look at the state of Oregon. The whole state was a sundown state, right? If a black family moved in, they showed up, they said you got a month to leave. This is
My parents had a
liberal
green
Oregon.
book. My parents had a green book, and I didn't know what.
Wow!
Yeah, and I
I
didn't
didn't
know
know
what it
what.
meant as a kid. But they had a green book because
That's fascinating.
I'm
I
from
knew
Montgomery.
nothing.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Montgomery,
Yeah,
Alabama is where. Yeah.
I knew nothing. I'll be honest. I knew nothing about the Green Book until the movie came out. I really didn't know about that. I should have known. Because you have to ask yourself, how did black people go around at that time?
Yep. They had a
Think
green
about
book.
think about Sammy Davis Jr. He used to have to stay on the other side of the track, for example, so to speak. You, speaking of, here's an interesting little factoid. The other side of the tracks. You know, pop music, popular music in America, not just with
Right.
hip hop. Okay,
Right.
we go back to the beginning. Okay, of popular music itself, from blues to jazz, ragtime, you name it. Right, every single form of popular music, a is black music.
Mhm.
Why do
Mhm.
we know for certain? This is not conjecture. This is musical history. Is because the syncopated beat is exclusive to Africa. That offbeat, the da da da. That is not polka. Does not come from Europe. Has nothing to do with Europe. Okay,
Oh,
it is purely and exclusively an African import. So therefore, we know all popular music is fundamentally and genetically African in nature.
even
Period.
K-pop.
Right. Oh, of course. Well, that's very derivative. And I'll tell you what, it's very derivative of LA hip hop, because
Mm.
there's so many Koreans that live in LA that if you listen to K-pop, you can really hear it's not a Memphis sound, right?
Mhm.
It's not Southern rap, it's not Chicago style, it's not New York style. It's a very LA hip hop type of influence music. In my opinion, that's my
Right. Right.
analysis of K-pop. But so going back, and one of the interesting points that I've heard made is that the introduction of black music to a wide to the wider audience, to wide mainstream America, was a result of the fact that on the other side of the tracks you had brothels. You had these white men crossing the tracks, sitting in waiting rooms at these brothels, and they were playing the latest records, black music at the time,
Mhm.
which is why you constantly had this crossover where you know, people who are otherwise, I mean, right up until Elvis Presley, right? They refused to play Elvis's records at first because, prior to the world of TV and videos and stuff like that, a lot of white radio hosts thought Elvis was black,
Mhm.
and they refused to play what they called race music. That's what they called
Mhm.
it at the time.
Right. Right. Mhm.
Rock and roll was called race music because it was black people music, right? And a lot of radio stations rebelled. Later on, when they found out Elvis was white, then you see it break into the mainstream, etc. Jerry Lee Lewis very openly learned his music. Both of them very openly learned their music from
Remember how they treated
the honky
Charlie
tonks.
Pride?
And
They wouldn't play him on TV and the radios either because they knew he was black, But
right.
well, no, they played him on the radio, but they would not let him like appear on TV shows because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the country stars were on these variety shows on TV. So a lot of because I grew up watching a lot of these variety shows with the country music singers and all that, but I would hear Charlie Pride on the radio and I did not know that he was black. I had no idea Charlie Pride was black.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, so we're talking about the idea of making change in the system. So we were talking about Jim Crow, right? And now with the reintroduction of Jim Crow, the modern day version of
Hmm.
Jim Crow is something like voter ID laws. Why is most well-to-do people? What's wrong with showing your voter ID? Especially because there's this false narrative that these illegals or these people are voting multiple
Right.
times, etc. Right? First of all, the only case of voter fraud in the past however long is actually a few right-wing people deliberately voted twice because they said, because all those illegals in California are voting twice.
And they live in Florida in a
Yeah.
retirement home
So,
near Trump.
go figure. Again, these these delusional forms of alternate realities that exist within the ecosphere of the right wing, completely detached from reality. And that's kind of the next kind of segue I want to get into with the notion of outside the Beltway, where I mean, we're no longer dealing with reality based uh, political discourse, right?
No.
So one of the things that I maintain is that we no longer live in a political world, right? We no longer have such things as political discourse. We now only have emotional intelligence or the lack thereof.
Hmm.
We're dealing with levels of basically society wide mental illness, society-wide delusion,
Mm-hmm.
society-wide psychosis, society-wide sociopathy, right? You see this introduction of this political ideal of you know, helping other people is a form of weakness. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh, this aversion, especially within amongst conservatives and Republicans, the idea of welfare and helping homeless people or
Brett
et cetera,
Favre is the
helping people.
welfare queen. He's one of the biggest welfare queens. Brett Favre,
Yeah,
all those guys that got the
right. That
PPP.
was that. There was yeah, there was that huge controversy there. But again, there is a huge disconnect. I mean, we are not okay. This is the decided case. No conservative, they don't even know about it. But there's a huge amount of it they don't even know about it. But for them, their analysis is not such that giving a rich person, a businessman, a government loan, right? And we call that corporate welfare, right? They don't see
Mm-hmm.
it as that. They're job creators, right? So they
Mm-hmm.
don't see it as a negative thing. If you really get down to it, what bothers them the most is that you're helping people who are weak and oppressed. That's what really irks them. Again, it's an empty gap. We are not talking about politics anymore. We are talking about emotional intelligence. We are talking about the ability for people to care about other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's lacking, right? It's kind of um, um, institutional cruelty,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is another
That's a
great
great
term.
way to put it. A great way to put that.
Yeah. So if you look at Johann Galtung, he's the godfather of peace studies, Swedish academic, and he talks about he didn't coin the word, but he sort of coined the word and popularized the term institutional violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
That our institutions as is have violence structured into it. Actually, he calls it structural violence. Excuse me, structural violence. That, for example, like capitalism or our government system, it's structured within the system so that the system, as it works, creates the violence, and that is a way of understanding what's wrong with our policing, right? So when you hear people say, "Oh, the system is broken," what makes you think the system is broken? What if it's designed to be this way? What if the system is doing exactly what it's designed for? In other words, if we understand what structural violence looks like, what institutional violence looks like, then we can understand in a more sophisticated way what policing as an institution is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why does policing look the way it is? Because it was designed that way. It's
Tyree
designed.
Nichols.
That's well, and that's why it. What was interesting is all these black cops were responsible for this. That's very important to understand that comes as no surprise to those who understand the system and oppression in a sophisticated and nuanced manner, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem here is not so much black and white as institutions and structures. What does that mean? The mayor uh, of that had been on a big tough on crime. That was his big thing. And every
Mm-hmm.
single chance he had, he's been increasing more police, adding more police to the street. Scientifically speaking, between the number of police and decrease of crime. We've never established any sort of correct connection. Furthermore, and he had created in these strike teams that they belong to this thing called the Scorpion team, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was
Mm-hmm.
this idea of these fast reaction, ultra militarized. That's another thing, the militarization of police, right? This is the
Mm-hmm.
layover of this military industrial complex, prison industrial complex. Now we see them fusing. This is another characteristic of fascist societies, of authoritarian societies, of a police state, where you see this increasing fusion of institutions, right? Where that culture of militarism is bleeding over, right? So you see the militarization of the police. Now you're seeing the
Included in that, though,
militarization,
Biden giving more money to the police did not
right?
make matters help matters at all.
Right,
Like he's
and
got
they're
to
getting,
take blame for this too.
of course, and let's remember that I don't make any important distinction between Democrats and Republicans when it
Mm,
comes to, for example, policing, when
mhm,
it comes to waging war. Now, are there differences? Of course, yeah, and many people have cited it. There's a lot of differences between them, and they do make a difference, because Republicans really are, just deranged and
mhm,
sociopathic and delusional. Democrats, at least rhetorically and outwardly, do support
mm,
things like the environment and poor people and stuff like that. So there
mm,
are differences in policy, but fundamentally there are corporate parties, right? And they do the masters of the universe, right?
mhm,
And so one metaphor is Republicans will stab you from the front while Democrats will stab you from the back. You're still
exactly.
getting stabbed to death, right?
Exactly.
So they'll tell you they'll speak the language of the poor while they're sticking it into your back. So again,
Mhm.
I don't want to be sloppy in the logic and say that they're nothing but the same, but they are two sides of coin, or the same coin,
Right, right.
right? So again,
That's the only
how do
point I
we
was trying
understand
to
that?
make too. It's like we understand the nuances of the differences, but some of that blame with this policing, which is out of hand and ridiculous. Especially me as a woman of color. You're a man of color in this country. It's enraging to me. It's just enraging.
Mhm. Yeah, right. And I remember if Obama was this progressive savior, why did Black Lives Matter start on administration? You know what I mean?
Hmm.
What did he truly do for Black people? I'm not saying he did nothing, okay, but again,
Right,
when it
right, right.
comes to the really salient issues like killing innocent Black men by
Reparations.
police, right? Well, let's get into reparations. Yeah, that's a great discussion as
Yeah,
well.
right,
And
right.
and, and
We'll
let me give you
discuss
my quick
that.
little. Sure, let me give you my quick little byline for people who revile at Black reparations, slavery reparations. The question is not, well, how do you expect to pay reparations? I mean, who gets included or not? See, you're getting ahead of yourself. The question
Mm,
at hand is, do you think it's the right thing to do? We'll discuss how it's done, how it's enacted later. That's another question. It's a good question.
mhm,
We should look into it.
mhm,
But you're trying to distract the real question. Are you trying to cover up the fact that you genuinely don't want to, because you don't want to face the harsh reality of the fact that the country was built upon Black bodies? You know, um, let's take a look. So I don't know if you know this. Washington D.C. was, I believe, America's first city on a grid, and
mhm,
the architect was a Black man.
mhm. The White
So,
House.
oh, you're right. Um, let let's talk about Democrats.
Right,
Woodrow
right.
Wilson, okay, Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, progressive, liberal, etc. He was very, very Christian. Let's not get that point as well. Very religious, very, very fervently religious. Um, he was such a virulent racist. He was the first person that came in and segregated Washington D.C., segregated the White House, fired all the Black staff. Now, the White House has been staffed by Black domestic workers since its inception. Not that that was this great thing, but that's what the primary occupation of most free Blacks was. Porters, train porters. About
Mm,
that whole famous thing, and then housing staff, cooks, etc. That's why it's not an accident that, for example, Aunt Jemima, these kinds of things, Mrs. Butterworth, and all that, they've now taken their image off. But what we forget is that in American culture, especially at that time, late 1800s, in order to have any kind of effective branding, you had to be associated with Black cooks. They were the ones who knew the secret recipes for fried chicken. They were the ones that knew how to make biscuits and gravy. They were our American cuisine. It was very much a function of Black cooks and their secret recipes. They would, mammies would hand them down mother to daughter, so that you can keep your
Pancakes.
position. Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah, exactly. As
Pancakes.
the all of that, right? In order to keep your position in the big house, right? You would hand down those recipes. So for corporations at the beginning of what today we know as branding, you had to have some sort of, I don't know if you remember this. Do you remember the fast food joint Sambo's?
Yes. Yep. I
Right?
remember. I think we ate there when I was a
Yeah,
kid. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Now Sambo's, which is another term for Sambo is another term for
Derogatory kind of.
yeah, no, that's a good question. Sambos were like bucks, I guess. So, right. So you've got, okay, so Donald Bogle wrote the film book about black cinema. It's called Mammies, Bucks, Coons, there's five.
Right.
Mammies, Bucks, Coons, uh, Pickaninnies, and Mulattas,
Mm,
right? Those are the only five tropes that ever show up in cinema and literature, right?
mm,
And so Sambo's, I think, I can't remember. It's worked out. There's a whole academic discourse around the types, but having a Sambo cook your burger, right, was fundamental to quality, to
mm.
taste, to authenticity, right? And then it got really awkward when I was a kid, you know, being called Sambo's. They had to get rid of their logo, and I remember the replacement logo was a sad-looking sun. It was so awkward. And then eventually, I think they just went out of business anyway because, again,
Right.
with a name like that, which made a lot of sense 100 years ago, made a ton of sense 100 years ago. Just by the time you reach
Things
the 70s and
change. I
80s,
mean, we
yeah,
evolve. We're supposed to
it just
evolve
got it just
anyway.
got so awkward. Yeah, I'm not saying that was a good or bad thing, but
Right, right,
I think
right.
we need to
But Ron
understand.
DeSantis is trying to basically Ron DeSantis is trying to he's trying to erase the existence of black people in our history.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
Again, I think it's important that so when we understand someone like Ron DeSantis and his policies, and to understand that we sugarcoat it by calling it conservative, I think we need to understand that it's about fascism, right? And fascism is a very specific kind of
mhm,
political formation, and a key characteristic of fascism is a very fundamental and profound anti-intellectualism. And what do we mean by that?
mhm.
In other
Yep.
words, in other words, science. They detest science, right? Political debate. If you look at the way in which so-called conservatives debate, they don't debate facts, logic, reason, etc. They attack you and then put you on the defensive.
Mhm.
Okay, it's very crude and cynical. As a matter of fact, maybe for the next one, I can share a video of there's this
Okay.
great YouTube channel where he spends a lot of time trying to understand the conservative mind or lack
Mhm.
thereof,
Right, right.
because you'll see that. So the
And they
reason for that is,
relish that because of Boebert. She's a prime example. She
well,
did.
yeah,
I'm
exactly.
not saying that
Know,
all people that
yeah,
don't get a high school diploma, but she's a prime
yeah,
example.
no, Marjorie Green, etc.
Mhm.
So these people are just out of their minds. I mean, just again, delusional, deranged. However, it's important to realize that their base is part of this fascist ilk, and they are anti-intellectual. And what that means is, um, uh, we've now studied, because of the Enlightenment, we assumed that humans think rationally and logically, but they don't. When you study it, we think emotionally and hysterically, right?
Mhm.
So we think by association. Every logical fallacy, what they call logical fallacy, is actually just an identification of how humans think.
Mhm.
And that's why we point out logical fallacies, because we want to avoid them, because they lead to unjustified conclusions, right? But that's how humans evolved. Hey, those people that live over the hill, they eat babies for fun. That was important for human survival. Just stay away from those strangers over there,
Mhm.
right? So that's what served us for most of our history, right? So that's why. So, for example, if you look at the Nazis, right, and this is kind of the topic you wanted to hopefully get to, there was this guy Heisenberg. He's the man behind the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The idea that you can't know any subatomic particle, you can't know both its position and speed at the same time. You can only know one or the other. One of the most important observations, one of the most important quantum physicists at the time. He was the head of the Nazi nuclear program.
Mm-hmm.
And now, after the war, he said that he deliberately sabotaged them. A lot of people tend to believe him because they were a full decimal point off. So while the West was working with minute amounts of fissile material, they spent all of their time trying to get a large amount, like a baseball size amount, when you just didn't need that much. Being a full decimal point off is egregious in quantum physics. I mean, we were literally talking about 10 times more material, if you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So he was looked at with a lot of suspicion in the Nazi Party. He was a Nazi. He was a member of the Nazi Party. But their name for him was White Jew, because he did Jew physics, which is why we successfully built the bomb. All of our nuclear physicists were German Jews, right? All our physicists came from
Like
Germany.
that descent, or what's his name, Santos, right? The
Oh yeah, he
Santos.
supposedly. I love George Santos because, to me, George. There's a very important analysis talking about the self-made man and how George Santos and Donald Trump epitomize it, because America is built around, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Anyone can become a self-made man. Um, you can invent yourself out of thin air. George Santos is the epitome of everything American. This is why I love George Santos, because, again, the way in which Trump exposed the fundamentally undemocratic nature of the Electoral College, I think George Santos is exposing the fundamentally deranged foundations of American culture.
Mm-hmm.
He epitomizes it. That's why when somebody posted on Facebook, they said, "Who do you nominate to represent? If aliens came, who would you nominate to represent humanity?" I said, George Santos. Run. We're fucking crazy.
Right,
We're,
right.
we're just delusional. I mean, you can't write this
Everything that
stuff
the
better.
Republicans are against, he is like, with the cross dressing.
And this is,
Uh,
yes, and this is what I'm getting at with the delusional nature of the right and the hypocritical nature. And so here's another example of that. During the Trump election, right, you had Mark Rubio up in arms saying, "Evangelicals, I'm your candidate. I'm the evangelical Christian. I'm the one spouting all this Jesus bullcrap that you guys eat up." Yet 91% of all evangelicals voted for Trump. How did they know instinctively, right? Instinctively know that even the guy who's the actual evangelical guy, and yet the guy that they knew represented him, was a divorcee, was very and non-religious, right? Because we mistakenly think that evangelical Christianity has something to do with religion or Christianity. We don't have any problem understanding that when it comes to Islam. We look at a Muslim terrorist fundamentalist, and we say, well, actually, that's nothing to do with Islam, and they're breaking fundamental tenets of Islam. And the Al Qaeda manual says, avoid recruiting any Muslim that's familiar with the Quran, right? Likewise, with religious literacy, they've studied this. Um, People who are religious know less about religion than people who are not religious, right? Not only that, the more religious you are, the less you know. Not only that, the more religious you are, the less you know about your own religion.
there was
These have been
family.
confirmed. Okay.
There was a family, a religious Christian family, well, actually two, that were Trump supporters, and I think I read the article last night. It was they did a murder suicide in the name of Trump. The father
Wow.
shot the mother, and or no, the mother shot the daughter or killed the daughter, and then the father killed the mother, and then the father killed himself, all in the name of Trump.
That
But they were Christian.
great. That's uh, the CEO of Walmart. One of the most. I mean, they've again they're not fair yet. What 38% of their. So do you want to take go first? I'm gonna go get my
Of
electric plug.
what? Oh, okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
get my electrical plug if you want to take over for a second.
Okay. Okay. Let me see. I'm gonna pull up. While you go ahead and do that, and I'm gonna play this. Let's see. I think it was this video that you sent me. Hold on a second. I'm gonna play. Okay, here it is. Uh, okay. Yep. I'm gonna flip this around. Share. All right.
37, Chairman Mao publicly put forth a work named Combat Liberalism. The title of this work is misleading to those who do not understand the Marxist meaning of the word liberal. This should not be confused with the way we use the word liberal today. This is not liberal as in the political scale that exists in contemporary politics. This is not some lambasting of Barack Obama or Bill Clinton type people. Nor is this a criticism of the popular liberal positions that exist within the media or the popular consciousness of society today. For example, the Al Franken defense of gun control or the very toothless criticisms of the war in Iraq by CNN. The Marxist definition of liberal has more to do with the liberal way of life than a non-confrontational que sera attitude. Liberalism is the idea that we should just stand by while harmful things happen so as not to supposedly risk the situation becoming worse. It is being free with speech without fully analyzing what we are saying, thus leading to a promotion of ignorant statements and phony criticisms. For example, people calling Barack Obama a communist for bailing out the banks, like George Bush did, while failing to understand that a communist would have actually abolished the banks and made them state property. This would be an irresponsible and stupid criticism to make. Those who make such an ignorant remark would deserve and need to be called out and criticized themselves. The Marxist, but mostly Maoist liberal manifests itself in various ways. For brevity's sake, I'll be sticking to the main forms of liberalism. To let things slide for the sake of peace and friendship when a person has clearly gone wrong, and refrain from principled argument because he is an old acquaintance, a fellow townsman, a schoolmate, a close friend, a loved one, an old colleague or subordinate. Or to touch on the matter lightly instead of going into it thoroughly so as to keep on good terms. The result is that both the organization and the individual are harmed. An example of this is, say, you're out with your friends and he or she says something that's racist and hopefully was meant in jest. Of course, these just joking moments are almost always a cover for some type of racism in the person that they're expressing just under the surface of their publicly acceptable appearance that they give. It is important not to allow this to pass simply because they are a friend. They have said something racist, and on a deeper level, they meant it. As their friend more than anyone, you have a responsibility to tell your friend that they are doing something harmful and remind them of that. You should not be complacent simply because you don't want to get into a debate about what it is and what is not racist or how much they actually meant it. To indulge in irresponsible criticism in private instead of actively putting forward one's suggestions to the organization. To say nothing to people to their faces, but to gossip behind their backs. Or to say nothing at a meeting, but to gossip afterwards. To show no regard at all for the principles of collective life, but to follow one's own inclination. In a socialist society, it is of the utmost importance that criticism be made public, so as not to only expose failings, but to have a free and open discussion of policy and the different directions and ideas. Criticism is the first step towards cronyism. It is a backward and useless trend among fascists. We have all seen those visions of pathetic yes men who automatically agree with everything their boss says so as to retain favor. This harms the entire essence of collectivism and might as well be regarded as reactionary. Not to obey orders, but to give pride of place to one's own opinions, to demand special consideration from the organization, but to reject its discipline. This is a very harmful liberal attitude. If the collective has spent the time and effort to create a plan to solve a problem, it should be followed out and judged on its results. One should never have the arrogance to assume that their opinion is greater than that of the collective decision-making of the people. This is a total objectivist, fascist position to assume one individual knows better than the decision-making power of all people affected by the decision. It assumes that the individual actions have no effect on anyone else. To indulge in personal attacks, pick quarrels, vent personal spite, or seek revenge instead of entering into an argument and struggling against incorrect views for the sake of unity or progress or getting the work done properly. I think this is something we are all guilty of. How many times have we lost our tempers with someone who has promoted an idea that we thought was a counter to a proper Marxist line? I'm reminded of one such incident where a comment was left by another Marxist that claimed Chinese women were dragged into the streets and beaten for dressing in a provocative way. Of course, this is completely untrue, but instead of countering the claim, I just lost my temper and made angry, insulting remarks.
Okay, so I'll just pause there. So your thoughts on the other side of that video?
Yeah, so I think one of the questions that you had was, how is it that, for example, when you're thinking about the history of fascism, just to make it clear, because almost no conservative knows what fascism means or its history, fascism is a 20th century invention, okay? And it was invented in Italy and by Mussolini, and it refers to the fasces. It was a bundle of axe handles that was the symbol of power in ancient Rome, right? The idea of multiple axe handles bound together represents greater strength. So that was the fasces, and so that later led to fascism under Italy, and it was like the idea of a new Roman Empire, which is why Germany called theirs the Third Reich, because that would be the third empire. The first Roman Empire, the second one was the Germans in the Carolingian dynasty, etc. Charlemagne and all that. These were German tribes that brought back the whole, what they call the Holy Roman Empire, and so there's the idea was that was the third Roman Empire. Now, the majority of conservatives, when you say fascism, they think, communist Soviet Union. It's just very bizarre. So
Right,
they mix authoritarianism with fascism. No, fascism is you. Fascism is conservatives. Fascism is America. Here's an interesting point. One of the kind of the these days, one of the most popular experts in fascism, I can't remember his name, Andrew something. He was asked, what are some of the prior to fascism, what are the closest analogs you can think of? And he was like, oh, that's an interesting question. He's like, well, I guess the best analog I can think of is 19th century America and the KKK. So he considers the KKK proto-fascism. So again, Democratic Party, America, fascism. We have a very rich history of authoritarian fascism, as well as communism. Prior to the advent of communism, you had multiple utopian communitarian experiments in America. So we also forget that America was a rich breeding ground for the far left forms of social organization. So even before there was communism, you had American experiments in what later got labeled as communism, but I'm talking communism with a small c, not with a capital C. And just to make it clear, I'm not endorsing Jason Unruh. I'm not endorsing Maoists. I'm not endorsing his organization. I'll flat out say they're weird. They're kind of a cult, and
Mhm.
they're just bizarre. And I am not now, nor have I ever been a communist. I'll just say that.
Right. Right.
You know, but what I will say is, regardless of the fact that I'm not a Marxist, I never have been, and I mostly reject what I call organized Marxists because they almost always tend to be very cultish. And out of that, the Maoists are always the worst.
Mhm.
Don't ask me why. Well, I have theories as to why, but that's a different story. However, I almost always use their scholarship. Yeah, the one thing about Marxists is they do great analyses. It's thorough enough. I don't think it goes like they're wrong though.
Mhm.
So I just want to make that clear. But now, what happened in Nazi Germany was during the Weimar Republic. So after World War One, you had the Weimar Republic, right? They moved their seat of power and everything. You had a very left progressive government, as it were, among states anyway.
Mhm.
German society in the 20s and 30s, okay, we're talking about you had artists, poets, homosexuals, Jews that were in the government in the Weimar Republic, okay? The
Mhm.
Secretary of State under the Weimar Republic was a Jew, okay? So you had this very progressive, relatively speaking, government. In fact, the Weimar Republic had the Institute for Gay and Lesbian Sexuality. you know,
Mhm.
they were pretty much the first of its kind. If you watch the films of Nazi book burnings, that
Mhm.
classic film you've seen, the very first Nazi book burning was they pulled out the entire research library of the Gay Sexuality Research Institute and burned it. Okay, so let's make it clear that it's not as if Germany was some sort of very pre-Nazi place and then they just sort of took over. No,
Mhm.
it was quite the opposite.
Right.
Um, so the idea that it could never happen here, um, it is 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 a very naive liberal position, you know,
And
because
it's
liberals over
insulting.
there, they never thought it could happen. Pardon me?
And it's insulting considering the history of what happened in Germany. For them to say that, it's like a form of gaslighting, and it's just insulting all the way around. Because we
Right.
see what's happening, and nobody's doing
Mhm.
anything to stop it. That has the power to do that.
Right. And now the comparison here is between our society and pre-final solution Nazi Germany. I'm not saying that we're dragging people out of the street and executing them, but 20s and 30s Nazi Germany, sure. There's tremendous amounts of analogs, and there's a lot of scholarship on that. If you want to look it up, you can
Mm,
research that. That's been well attested to, even by liberals. Frankly, I have pointed out the fact that yes, America at this point is very much within early Nazi society and policy. So when you're asking how does that happen, it would appear as though society tends to break up into thirds: one third left, one third right, one third center, something like that. Um, Now, the thing is, the right always, it's always easier to organize on the right. Why? Because they're all about the strong leader, they're all about following rules, taking orders. Whereas on the left, they say the classic thing is that it's like herding cats, right?
mm,
People on the left are independent thinkers, very critical. They do analyses. So you have a lot of fracturing as people go kind of down the rabbit hole of further and further analysis and taking into the subtleties. I had a professor. He's African in grad school. His favorite thing was, on the other hand, and he go blah 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 blah. On the other hand, blah 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 blah. On the other, and he would do that like 7 or 8 or 9 times in a row. It was just he was like he's such a genius. And we all loved him. And that's the thing. On the left, it's on the other hand, and then you say the very exact opposite point, and then you make yet another opposite point, and no, and you go on. So understanding complexity, subtlety, nuance, and contradiction. That's why it's so important that we cite the fascist right as being anti-intellectual, because in order to understand something as complex as reality, something as complex as human society, something as complex as politics, something as complex as society, culture, etc., power, we have to understand that sometimes it's very subtle, nuanced, complex. Sometimes it's contradictory. This is the thing that conservatives have the most difficult time with. They're like, well, we have so much freedom. In fact, we have so much freedom. You and this black lady are able to say these things publicly, right? Isn't that an incredible amount of freedom? Um, so these are the contradictions. Yes, we do
Mhm.
have certain civil liberty, freedoms of civil liberty, right? But uh, a complex analysis will show you that yes, but where is the mainstream and where is outside the mainstream, and what sort of power do we have, right?
Mhm.
So the instruments of power and control are much more subtle in America, and it's achieved through, for example, media, right? So today, the largest corporations in the world are media companies. 20 years ago, they were weapons manufacturers like GE. These were the biggest companies. Today, they're the people who manage thought and popular opinion. Okay.
And
So
they
that's
are
very
fast.
important. And they are what?
They're fascists because they don't want to pay taxes.
Right. And now so when we're talking about the bleed over of militarization, right? Now we're seeing the militarization of thought and speech. That's what I mean by media, the militarization of media. You
Mhm.
know, this what do I mean by militarization? The use of discipline within the fifth estate to create discipline amongst the population, to keep popular revolt, popular rebellion, and popular revolution down, to stick to that liberal position. You know, sure, things aren't so good, but we'll make it a little better, a little bit at a time. Two important books to cite on this is Chris Hedges. Uh, a long time ago, he wrote Christian Fascists, where he talks about the growing evangelical movement and how that it's actually a form of political fascism. It's not
Mhm.
really a religion. And then he also wrote a book called the um, the Death of the Liberal Class, where again he talks about how in a functioning society, usually you have a liberal class whose role it is to be like a spigot on decreasing some of the oppression,
They're
so that
gatekeepers, the gatekeepers,
right, right.
because
So they're gatekeep.
people don't realize liberal media doesn't exist. It's a myth.
Mhm, right. And but there is. So, for example, Amy Goodman, her husband Alan, what's his name? There is amazing journalism and media out there. Okay,
Mhm.
now it's outside the mainstream. You know, you can look at Noam Chomsky, Max Blumenthal, consortiumnews.com,
Well, yeah, I
The
meant like the
Intercept,
mainstream Beltway
Glenn
media.
Greenwald. So yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So the mixing those two elements together, and now Chris Hedges argues that with the death of the liberal class, we no longer even have a liberal class who's able to alleviate some of the oppression and some of the suffering so as to prevent revolution, which is why Chris Hedges for years now has been saying there is no more political action except to rebel.
Mhm.
So we're ripe for revolution. The problem is when you have a radical, catastrophic breakdown of society, it doesn't necessarily, out of the ashes, doesn't necessarily come some sort of left revolutionary, communistic type of thing. In fact, sometimes out of the ashes, like in Nazi Germany, you see fascism develop. And that's kind of where it seems like we're headed. You see, the rise of this white nationalist, evangelical, they're taking our guns. I want my gas stove. It's become just deranged and bizarre, highly
M&Ms are
militant.
sexy, and it makes me
Pardon me?
mad. They're crying about sexy
Oh, yeah.
M&Ms.
So if you want to know how that sort of project was initiated, there's a great documentary about Ralph Nader called "The Most Dangerous Man," and in it, a biography of Ralph Nader is a lot like a history of U.S. politics for the past, you know, you know, 50 years. Okay, because he's been involved since he was a young man. And in it, they interview Pat Robertson, and he said during the Reagan Revolution, he said it was something like 2-1 at that time. It was something like 2-1 Democrats to Republicans. Right? He was like, we were never going to win another election. We were finished. We were through. This is coming out of the '60s, right? Nixon, yeah, they were through. They were finished as a party. And he said we had to find a way to split the Democratic coalition, right? And he said the way we did that was through culture wars. So things like abortion, and all the kinds of, a prayer in school, these kinds of things. And he's like, that's how we split the Democratic coalition and got in there. So the idea of culture wars was invented. And also, we have to circle back really quickly. Why is voter suppression so important? It was at this time that a very prominent conservative, right-wing political operative was, I think, secretly recorded giving a speech. You can look it up now. And he makes it clear. He says, we don't have a chance numerically of conservatives getting elected anymore. The only chance we have is if voter turnout is low, it inherently favors conservative candidates, and high voter turnout inherently favors left progressive. So voter suppression at that point became very important to the right, which is why you see in red states this massive effort to do voter fraud. If you want to look into more about voter fraud, you can look up God, I'm blanking on his name.
Now that would explain
Greg Palast.
Who?
Greg Palast. Greg Palast. Another great investigative journalist who's American, who in fact is from Los Angeles. He's from the Valley, grew up in the Valley. And where does he work? England. He can't get a job in America because he does investigative journalism.
The Federalist Society was founded in 1982. Kind of circling back to what you were talking about, the Republicans saying they could never win again.
Mm-hmm.
So they were
so you have the Federalist Society, you have the American Heritage Institute, you have this whole series of foundations, think tanks. It was at this time also the what do they call themselves? It's like the constitutional. There's a group.
The Constitution, I know what you. Let me see, constitutionalist.
All like Scalia, John Roberts, all of them come from this organization, which believes in the literalist interpretation of the Constitution. It doesn't even exist as a legal theory.
Okay? They're from Yale, the University of Chicago Law School, and Harvard. All of those schools. So they're the top.
But it's not the schools themselves. It's a separate.
No. I'm saying the members come from those institutions.
Okay, fine. Yeah, but they are this fake legal theory that doesn't exist. A lot like the field of economics. The field of economics is a fictional academic discipline, right? It's mythology and religion posing as empirical science. It just isn't. I'm not saying there's no important empirical findings from, there are people, for example, that do behavioral economics. That's actually very interesting. That shows how people actually behave within an economy. But these free trade fundamentalists, that's just a religion. It's debunked. It's based on false assumptions, and it's still propagated in spite of the fact that it's debunked. It's essentially a fraud. It's like Scientology. Things like economics, University of Chicago, primarily out of them, they create, that the Nobel Prize in economics is the only one that's not one of the original ones. It's separately funded. So Mr. Nobel's cash prizes that come with the prize come from his foundation. Only the Nobel Prize for economics comes separately. because they
I
had to
didn't know that.
create that. They had to create that because they wanted to make us believe that there is such a thing as economics.
Mm.
I believe there can be a field of economics. For example, for a while there was a thing called Marxist economics, which took into account, um, dialectical materialism, et cetera. That had a lot more interesting results. But again, that was quickly stamped out. Again, at this time in the '80s, they had this long-term program where they said, in the next 30 years, we're going to get rid of all these Marxist economists, and we're going to replace them with our free market people. So this is a concerted effort, and this is the bizarre part. These conservatives, um, these people, these on the right, they think of themselves as free thinkers. They think of themselves as having arrived at these, and they don't realize they're the most propagandized population in the history of the universe. I mean, that that you can literally link actual dollars to the shit that comes out of their mouth, even that they're going to say that they think that they've come up with it on their own and that they're independent thinkers. Which is what's so bizarre, which is why they label liberals, not, again, they don't even know what that means, but they cite liberals as fascists, which is literally
All
impossible.
projection. It's projection.
It is. Well, that's another thing too, is I would say because the right has become so pathological that they can't help but engage in projection. So, for example, they'll label people on the left as unicorns. Oh, you guys are snowflakes, right? And yet here they are, the most whiniest, weakest, frailest, most hysterical
Yes,
Americans
exactly.
you've
It's
ever seen.
exhausting though that we see this,
It's
but
projection.
it's so exhausting though.
Yeah, and that's why I think that's why I say we live in a post-political era. You cannot engage this population in dialogue because they find facts slightly Jewish or demonic or satanic. You name it, whatever you want to call it. You know, what was it? The commentator from Fox News. Facts tend to have a liberal bias. I mean,
And I say again, it's like liberal, that kind of the mainstream media they call liberal is a myth because
yeah.
you go in to find out who owns it. Those
Hmm.
people are not friends of democracy. The people that
Right.
own our media are not friends of
Right.
democracy.
Right. Right. And this goes back to the founding fathers who very specifically said, you know, the point of our government is not democracy as we say publicly, but it's to protect the wealthy
Hmm.
from the dispossessed, right? In other words, the fundamental problem with democracy for the founding fathers was, what if the majority organized and voted in their best interest to eliminate the possibility of super rich controlling the society? We can't have that.
Hmm.
In other words, what if they abolish the damn plantation? We can't have that. So that's why our government is structured the way it is. Our imagination of democracy is such that we've got this liberal class, like you said, the gatekeepers, to make sure you do everything else but what you fundamentally need to do, which is fundamentally change the society, abolish the plantation, free the slaves, etc. I mean, the project hasn't changed. Its aesthetics have, you know, its
Hmm.
optics have changed, but
Right.
those differences are cosmetic, right? But they're fundamentally the same. Let's call it a prison planet, not to mention, not as
I
a
have
reference to
actually
Alex
said
Jones.
that. I have
Well,
actually
that's
said
Alex.
that.
Well, that's Alex Jones's thing. His prisonplanet.com or whatever.
No, I would not the way he said it, but I basically
Yeah,
like I think I made a TikTok about it. I said I feel like I'm
yeah.
trapped on a prison planet. Like that.
Well, I would say that what happens in Palestine will happen everywhere else.
Mm,
So you look at Palestine, it's just one big, huge open air prison. And I believe that's the future model. That's where the surveillance state comes in. We've got drones flying over every single city that have cloaking devices that track every human movement by an algorithm. This has been in effect already for a long time. Nobody wants to tell you this.
Well, I've actually China. What scared me off, like I wanted to go, of course I can't afford to go pay attention, let alone visit anywhere. But I was watching a documentary about China and their surveillance state about I want to say 10 or 15 years ago. Then, with what they were showing of their surveillance state, then I was like, I don't think I want to even make a layover over in China because I'll risk, getting my face scanned and like,
Yeah, but
being.
what makes you think we're not doing that?
Well, I know we are too. We're
We're
doing the
way
same
ahead of the
thing.
curve.
Huh?
We're
You think
way ahead of the
America's
curve.
ahead of China
Yeah, of course. Are you
with the
joking?
surveillance? I don't know, because
Of
their
course.
surveillance was just like a Black Mirror episode.
No. Hold on. The U.S. is way beyond face recognition. That's 40-year-old technology for the U.S. We now use recognition using the tops of our heads and our shoulders and the cadence of our gait.
When they, I've
GAIT.
seen those. I've seen those
Okay,
surveillance
so
videos.
so so yeah, maybe maybe China is finally joining the Stone Age and using facial recognition,
It
but
was
we are
scary.
way past that.
It was
Okay,
scary to me.
so
All of it. All
we
of it's
don't even
scary.
need a face anymore. Okay, you can cover your face; they'll still identify you by how you walk.
It's all scary. But and
Right.
I was telling somebody else with the satellites. They were talking about, oh, they're coming to get your guns and this and that. We were having a debate about guns, which you and I talk about later. But I said,
Mhm.
if America wanted to come get your guns, do you know what kind of hardware they got? They got satellites right now floating above the planet that could, if your curtain is open, they can shoot a laser into your window of your house. I
Mhm.
mean, whatever you got for a shotgun or whatever, it's not going to go
Oh,
up against the
it's
government.
it's not going to go, but yeah, right. I see
Right,
what you
right.
mean.
It's
Yeah,
not going
the
up against the
weapons in
government.
space. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, they have these tungsten rods up in these satellites that they drop, and as they accelerate, as they get close to Earth, I mean, when they hit a city, it's like a nuclear bomb.
Right. So these
It's
gun
just a
nuts
piece of
sound
metal, but
ridiculous. They sound ridiculous. Talk about, oh, they're coming to get my guns. I need my guns. I'm like, you would be vaporized in a second.
yeah, you're gonna lose. Well, they have microwaves that can just cook all the inhabitants of a city and leave the entire infrastructure. Um, you don't even have to destroy a city anymore. You could just cook all the inhabitants.
Yeah, man. What's that technology that the military has where it lets off a noise like a boom, and then like all the electronics go down?
Oh, it's not a noise. It's an EMP,
Oh, EMP. That's it. That's it.
electromagnetic pulse.
Hmm.
We don't have to do that. I mean, that's actually a big danger. The sun does it all the time,
Yeah.
but we have a magnetic. So because the Earth's core is molten metal,
Hmm.
we have basically the Earth is a gigantic magnet. It's got a north
Right.
and south pole, and that magnetic field protects us from the majority of the Earth's the sun's activities. Um, the problem is the polarity of the Earth switches every once in a while, and we're overdue for another pole shift, during which time we might become incredibly vulnerable to solar flares. And so we do need to be focusing on that. Now, does the government also have EMPs? Yeah, of course. Um, but it doesn't serve them any better than, I mean, if you pulse everyone, your own gear goes out, and they're more dependent than we are.
Right.
So that wouldn't serve their purposes. Now, it would serve the purposes to do that to an enemy, which, but you take a look at what Russia and Ukraine, Russia's been trying to knock out Ukrainian communications infrastructure. They still haven't succeeded. So, um,
So
you
they're
know,
trying to EMP them.
no, I don't. Again, they can't, because if you're there, you're going to APA yourself. So, um, they're just trying to bomb their radio stations and TV stations and things like that. But um, they still haven't succeeded in breaking their communications. So I don't think it's that easy to take out someone's grid. Um,
Well,
speaking of the
yeah,
fascists that are attacking power stations to try and prevent drag queen shows, I mean
right, right.
they've lost their minds. They've lost their minds,
That's
and
these gun nuts running around here.
that's why you going to really engage in a debate with people like that?
Nope.
They're deranged. And so this is where, I guess, I mean, if you want to conclude, this is what we can conclude with is Karl
Right,
Popper's paradox of a tolerant society, right? So
right.
Karl Popper was an intellectual that had to flee Nazi Germany, and he, after the war, he was just really upset. He was very and basically what he was saying is the paradox of an open society is that if you tolerate everyone,
Hmm.
even people who are intolerant, eventually those intolerant people will just kill the rest of you off, because
Hmm.
that's what happened in Nazi Germany, right? That people who didn't want to engage in debate and discourse, etc. So again, it's liberals in America that are like, you got to have Nazis, give them the freedom of speech. No, you don't. Let's
Hmm.
remember that after World War II, um, you had German Americans try to ignite the Nazi Party here in America, because there was a Nazi Party in America. There's
Yep.
a lot of support for Nazis
They
in
met in
America.
New York during the
Yeah,
war.
right, exactly. And now after the war, they started organizing again in public, and armed veterans went and shut all of them down. So they were the original Antifa. And Antifa only means anti-fascist.
Right.
If you are opposed to Antifa, then you're opposed to anti-fascist. That means you're pro-fascist. That means you think they should be allowed to meet in public. You think that they're a legitimate political discourse, and they're not. I think that, like the Black Bloc does, like Antifa, I think that we should never allow um, um, openly fascist people to organize in public.
Never.
You have to
Never.
shut them down.
And see, one thing the right has done though, they've taken terms like Antifa
Yeah,
and CRT. They're
oh
they're
yeah,
they're good in messaging, like turning it into like a boogeyman type thing.
it is. It is. And here's the thing. It's a two-edged sword. No sign is fixed. You can't. You
Hmm.
can't. You can't. Like, they tried to vilify Obamacare by calling it
Right,
Obamacare,
right,
and
right,
now it became a great thing. Everyone loves Obamacare.
right.
So they tried. So likewise, you can try to vilify CRT. Next thing you
Hmm.
know, if you've got a kid who actually likes reading books, he's going to
Hmm.
go, "What is CRT?" and be like, "Oh, geez." So
And it was only a law school, so yeah, it's backfiring.
yeah, exactly. It used to be a provincial thing in law school, and now the
Yeah,
whole country knows about critical race theory.
right.
Good, good. You know,
Because I'd only heard about it, but I'm not a lawyer. I wasn't interested in like law school
it's
stuff.
not it's not just in law school. Like, if you want, Stuart Hall years ago published the critical race theory reader. So that
Hmm.
has, readers are basically, they take abridged excerpts from the most important primary documents, given a field. So um, I'll see if I can pull it off my bookshelf,
Okay, so
and show
we're
it
going
to
to
you.
talk about that in our next show, and we will end it here because look, we talked a long time.
Yeah,
I'm so glad you joined me, Charles. This is so fun, and I'm looking forward to our second episode.
great.
And I hope all of you enjoyed it. Leave your comments and suggestions and questions, and let us know what you would like to hear. We want to have an interactive show as well. So share, comment, subscribe, and we will see you guys on the next show.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.